The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Riverside Music Academy, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Margaret Chun adjusted her silk scarf and checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Her last student of the day had just left, and she was already running behind schedule for the evening faculty meeting. Margaret had always prided herself on being punctual, organized, and above all, professional. At 42, she had spent the better part of her adult life building her reputation as one of the most respected piano instructors in the city. Her studio on the second floor of the academy was her sanctuary, complete with a stunning black grand piano that had cost more than most people's annual salary. She gathered her sheet music, carefully placing each piece in its designated folder. Everything in her world had a place, and everything belonged in its place. This attention to detail had earned her students spots at prestigious conservatories and had made her the go-to instructor for wealthy families who wanted nothing but the best for their children. As she prepared to leave, Margaret noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. The cover of her precious grand piano was slightly askew. Not dramatically, but enough for someone with her keen eye to notice. She frowned, walking over to adjust it properly. The piano was her pride and joy, a German-made instrument that responded to the slightest touch with the most beautiful, rich tones. Just then she heard the soft squeak of wheels rolling across the floor in the hallway. The evening cleaning crew was arriving. Margaret had seen them around the building for months, but she rarely paid much attention to the custodial staff. They did their job quietly and efficiently, which was exactly how she preferred it. The door to her studio opened, and a woman in her mid-50s entered, pushing a cart filled with cleaning supplies. She was petite, with graying hair pulled back, in a neat bun and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. This was Maria Santos. Though Margaret had never bothered to learn her name, Maria moved through the room with practiced efficiency, dusting the windowsills and wiping down the music stands. She worked quietly, respectfully, always careful not to disturb anything important. Margaret watched her work, noting how gentle she was with the expensive equipment scattered throughout the room, but then something happened that made Margaret's blood pressure spike. As Maria finished dusting the area around the piano, she paused. Her eyes lingered on the beautiful instrument, and slowly, almost as if she couldn't help herself, she reached out and gently touched one of the keys. The single note rang out clear and pure in the silence of the room. It was just one note, played so softly it was barely audible, but to Margaret it might as well have been a fire alarm. "Excuse me," Margaret said sharply, her voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife. Maria immediately pulled her hand back, startled by the sudden interruption. Margaret strode over to the piano, her heels clicking authoritatively on the hardwood floor. "Please stick to cleaning," she said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "These instruments are worth more than most people's cars. They're not toys." Maria's cheeks flushed red with embarrassment. She nodded quickly, not meeting Margaret's eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her accent adding a musical quality to her words even in her moment of shame. "I didn't mean any harm." "I'm sure you didn't," Margaret replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But these pianos are extremely sensitive. Even the oils from someone's fingers can damage the keys over time. I have students who have been waiting months just for the chance to play on this instrument." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Margaret felt completely justified in her reaction. She had worked hard to build her reputation and her studio. She had every right to protect her investment from people who didn't understand its value. Maria gathered her cleaning supplies quickly, her movements now hurried and nervous. The gentle confidence she had shown just moments before was completely gone, replaced by the demeanor of someone who had been firmly put in their place. "Of course I understand," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It won't happen again." Margaret watched as Maria finished her work in record time, avoiding even looking in the direction of the piano. The room fell silent except for the sound of cleaning supplies being packed away and the soft squeak of the cart wheels as Maria prepared to leave. For a moment, Margaret almost felt bad about her harsh response, but then she looked at her beautiful piano, gleaming under the studio lights, and her resolve strengthened. She had worked too hard and invested too much to let anyone treat her equipment carelessly. After Maria left, Margaret walked over to the piano and carefully wiped down the key that had been touched, even though she knew it hadn't been harmed. It was the principle of the matter. Standards had to be maintained. She locked up her studio and headed to the faculty meeting, the incident already beginning to fade from her mind. After all, she had more important things to worry about than a cleaning lady who didn't know her. Boundaries, but as she walked down the hallway, Margaret couldn't shake the image of Maria's face when she had been scolded. There had been something in the woman's eyes, something that went beyond simple embarrassment. It was a look of genuine pain, as if Margaret's words had cut much deeper than intended. Margaret pushed the thought away. She had done nothing wrong. She was simply protecting her property and maintaining professional standards. That was what successful people did. They set boundaries and enforced them consistently. The faculty meeting was long and tedious, filled with discussions about upcoming recitals and budget considerations. Margaret participated when necessary, but her mind kept wandering back to the incident in her studio. She told herself it was because she was concerned about security, about making sure the cleaning staff understood the value of the instruments they were working around. But deep down, something about the whole encounter bothered her. Maybe it was the way Maria had touched the piano key, not with curiosity or carelessness, but with something that looked almost like reverence. Or maybe it was the expression on Maria's face afterward, as if she had lost something precious. When the meeting finally ended, Margaret walked back through the now empty hallways of the academy. The cleaning crew was still working, their quiet efficiency ensuring that the building would be spotless for the next day's classes. She passed several custodians, nodding politely but not really seeing them as individuals. As she reached her car in the parking lot, Margaret allowed herself one last look back at the building. Somewhere inside, Maria was probably still working, carefully avoiding the studios with the expensive instruments, sticking to cleaning just as she had been told. Margaret drove home that night with a strange feeling in her chest, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. She had done the right thing, she told herself. She had protected her investment and maintained her standards. That was what mattered. Little did she know that her brief encounter with Maria would soon turn her entire world upside down, forcing her to confront assumptions she didn't even know she had made. Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart slowly down the empty hallway, her mind still replaying the embarrassing encounter from earlier that evening. The sting of Margaret's words lingered like a bad taste in her mouth. She had been cleaning buildings for over 10 years now, and she was used to being invisible, but something about tonight felt different. Something about the way that piano teacher had looked at her made her feel smaller than usual. As she entered the next classroom, Maria tried to focus on her work. Dust the desks, empty the trash, mop the floors. Simple tasks that she could do with her eyes closed. But her hands were shaking slightly, and she kept thinking about that single piano key she had touched. Just one note. One beautiful, perfect note that had transported her back to a time when music was her whole world. Most people at the academy saw Maria as just another member of the cleaning crew, someone who showed up after hours, did her job quietly, and disappeared before the morning classes began. They didn't know her story, and she preferred it that way. It was easier to be invisible than to explain how she had ended up here, pushing a mop instead of playing concertos, but Maria's life hadn't always been about cleaning supplies and late-night shifts. 15 years ago, in Bogota, Colombia, she had been someone completely different. Back then, she was Professor Maria Santos, one of the most respected piano instructors at the National University's Music Conservatory. Her students adored her, her colleagues respected her, and music critics wrote glowing reviews of her performances. She could still remember the weight of her concert dress, the way the stage lights felt warm on her face, and the absolute silence of the audience just before she began to play. Those were the moments when she felt most alive, when her fingers danced across the keys and created something beautiful out of nothing but touch and timing. Maria had started playing piano when she was just 5 years old. Her grandmother, who had worked as a seamstress to pay for lessons, recognized her granddaughter's talent early. "Music is a gift," her grandmother used to say. "But talent without hard work is just a pretty box with nothing inside." So Maria worked. She practiced for hours every day, even when her fingers ached and her back hurt from sitting at the bench. She won competitions, earned scholarships, and eventually landed a spot at the country's most prestigious music school. By the time she was 25, she was performing with the Bogota Philharmonic Orchestra and teaching the next generation of musicians. Life was good. She had a comfortable apartment near the university, a circle of friends who shared her passion for music, and a future that seemed bright and promising. She was even engaged to Carlos, a violinist who played in the same orchestra. They had planned to get married and maybe start a small music school together, but then everything changed. Carlos was killed in a car accident just 3 months before their wedding. The grief was overwhelming, but Maria threw herself into her music even more, using it as a way to process her pain. For a while that seemed to work. Her performances became more emotional, more powerful. Critics said she was playing with a new depth of feeling. However, the economic situation in Colombia was getting worse. The university was cutting budgets, and many of the cultural programs were being eliminated. Maria watched as her colleagues lost their jobs one by one. The orchestra was disbanded, and suddenly there were no opportunities for musicians like her when her sister Ana, who had immigrated to the United States years earlier, offered to help her come to America. Maria felt like she had no choice. Ana painted a picture of endless opportunities, of a country where hard work was always rewarded. "You can teach private lessons," Ana had said over the phone. "Rich American families pay lots of money for good music teachers." But reality was much harder than Ana had promised. When Maria arrived in the United States, she discovered that her Colombian music degree wasn't recognized. She would need to take expensive classes, pass difficult exams, and somehow prove that 15 years of professional experience in Colombia was worth something in America. The language barrier made everything worse. Maria's English was functional, but not fluent enough for teaching wealthy students whose parents expected perfection. She watched job opportunities slip away as parents chose instructors who sounded more American, or who had degrees from recognizable universities. Meanwhile, she still needed to eat and pay rent. Ana helped her get a job cleaning office buildings at night. "It's temporary," Ana assured her. "Just until you get your credentials sorted out." The temporary stretched into months, then years. The process of getting her qualifications recognized was expensive, complicated, and seemed to require more time than she had while working full-time. Maria applied for dozens of teaching positions, but the responses were always the same. Not enough American experience, credentials not recognized. "Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to go with someone else." Slowly, Maria began to lose hope. She stopped checking job boards for music teaching positions. She stopped talking about her plans to get certified. She even stopped playing piano altogether because it hurt too much to remember what she had lost: the cleaning job at the Riverside Music Academy was both a blessing and a curse. It paid better than her previous jobs, and the work wasn't too demanding. But being surrounded by music every night was like being constantly reminded of her former life. She would walk past practice rooms and hear students playing pieces she had once performed on stage. She would dust pianos that cost more than she earned in a year. Sometimes, late at night when the building was empty, Maria would allow herself to listen to the echoes of the day's lessons. She would hear the mistakes students were making, the techniques they were struggling with, and she would mentally coach them through their difficulties. If only she could help them, she thought. If only someone would give her a chance. Tonight, after being scolded by Margaret, Maria felt the familiar ache in her chest. She had just wanted to touch the piano, to feel the smooth keys under her fingers. For one brief moment. She hadn't meant to cause any trouble. She certainly hadn't meant to reveal how much she missed playing as she cleaned the rest of the building. Maria thought about calling her sister Ana. Ana was always encouraging her to keep trying, to not give up on her dreams. But Maria was tired of dreaming. She was 53 years old and she had bills to pay. Maybe it was time to accept that some dreams were meant to stay in the past. She finished her shift just before midnight, loading her supplies into the cart one last time. Tomorrow night she would be back, cleaning the same rooms, dusting the same pianos, and trying not to think about the music that lived in her heart but could no longer live in her hands. But as she walked to her car, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She didn't know what or how, but 15 years of cleaning buildings had taught her to trust her instincts. And tonight, despite the embarrassment and the harsh words, something felt different. 3 weeks had passed since the awkward encounter between Margaret and Maria, but the memory still lingered in Margaret's mind like an unwelcome guest. She had tried to push it away, focusing on her students and upcoming recitals, but something about that evening continued to bother her in ways she couldn't quite explain. It was a Thursday evening, and Margaret was staying late at the academy to prepare for the spring recital. Her most advanced student, a talented 16-year-old named David, was struggling with a particularly challenging piece by Rachmaninoff. She had been working on the arrangement for hours, marking fingering suggestions and making notes about tempo changes. The building was quiet except for the occasional sound of her own footsteps and the soft hum of the heating system. Margaret enjoyed these peaceful evening hours when she could work without interruption. The academy felt different at night, more intimate somehow, as if the music from the day's lessons still hung in the air. She was deep in concentration when she heard a voice in the hallway. At first, she thought it might be one of the security guards making their rounds, but as she listened more carefully, she realized it was a woman speaking in Spanish. The voice was soft and melodic, carrying a warmth that seemed to fill the empty corridors. Margaret felt a flicker of curiosity. She rarely heard Spanish spoken in the academy, and there was something about the cadence of the conversation that caught her attention. The woman was speaking slowly, with gentle pauses, as if she were talking to someone she loved very much. Unable to resist, Margaret quietly stepped to her door and opened it just a crack. Down the hallway she could see Maria, the custodian from that embarrassing evening weeks ago. She was talking on her phone, leaning against her cleaning cart, and despite the language barrier, Margaret could tell this was a deeply personal conversation. Maria's face was animated as she spoke, her free hand moving expressively to emphasize her words. Even though Margaret couldn't understand what she was saying, she could hear the emotion in Maria's voice. There was joy there, and love, and something that sounded almost like homesickness. As Margaret listened, she began to pick out familiar words scattered throughout the Spanish conversation. Words like música, piano, estudiantes, and concierto. Margaret had taken some Spanish in college, and while she was far from fluent, she could recognize these musical terms that seemed to transcend language barriers. What struck Margaret most was the way Maria's entire demeanor changed when she spoke these words. Her voice would lift, becoming more animated, and her eyes would light up with an enthusiasm that Margaret had never seen during their brief interactions. It was as if Maria was speaking about something she was truly passionate about. The phone conversation continued for several more minutes, and Margaret found herself mesmerized by the musical quality of Maria's voice. There was a rhythm to her speech that reminded Margaret of the way her best students talked about their favorite pieces. It was the voice of someone who understood music not just as sound, but as a language of the heart. When Maria finally ended her call, Margaret expected her to immediately return to her cleaning duties. Instead, Maria stood still for a moment, looking around the empty hallway with an expression that seemed almost wistful. Then, slowly, she began to walk toward the main music hall where the Academy's prize piano was located. Margaret felt her heart rate quicken. Was Maria going to try to touch the piano again? Should she intervene before anything inappropriate happened? But something held her back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the memory of that pained expression on Maria's face from weeks ago. Instead of confronting Maria, Margaret decided to follow at a distance. She slipped out of her studio and moved quietly down the hallway, staying far enough back to avoid being seen. Her high heels clicked softly on the marble floor. But Maria seemed lost in her own thoughts and didn't notice. The main music hall was bathed in soft moonlight streaming through the tall windows. The grand piano sat in the center of the room, like a sleeping giant, its polished surface reflecting the pale light. Margaret watched from the doorway as Maria approached the instrument slowly, almost reverently. For a long moment, Maria just stood there, staring at the piano. Margaret could see her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Then, as if she couldn't help herself, Maria reached out and gently touched the piano bench. Not the keys this time, just the simple wooden bench where students sat during their lessons. Margaret expected Maria to stop there, to remember the warning from weeks ago and step away. But instead, Maria did something that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. She sat down on the bench. The cleaning cart sat forgotten in the hallway. Maria placed her hands in her lap and closed her eyes as if she were preparing herself for something important. Margaret could see her taking deep, measured breaths, the way Margaret taught her own students to do before performing. Then, slowly, Maria raised her hands to the keyboard. Margaret tensed, preparing to intervene, but something in Maria's posture stopped her. This wasn't the curious touch of someone who didn't know better. This was the careful, deliberate movement of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Maria's fingers touched the keys with a gentleness that surprised Margaret. She didn't press down immediately, but seemed to be feeling for the right position, the correct placement. Her back was straight, her shoulders relaxed, her wrists positioned perfectly. It was the posture of a trained pianist, and then Maria began to play. The first notes that filled the room were soft and tentative, as if Maria was reacquainting herself with an old friend. But as the melody developed, her confidence grew. Margaret recognized the piece immediately. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful and challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. But this wasn't the halting, uncertain playing of an amateur. This was the work of a master. Maria's fingers moved across the keys with a fluidity and grace that Margaret had rarely seen, even among her most advanced students. Every note was perfectly placed, every phrase shaped with an understanding of the music that went far beyond technique. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her mouth slightly open in amazement. The music that filled the room was absolutely breathtaking. Maria wasn't just playing the notes on the page, she was telling a story, expressing emotions that words could never capture. The melody soared and dipped, whispered and sang, carrying both joy and sorrow in its elegant phrases. As the piece continued, Margaret found herself completely mesmerized. She had heard this nocturne performed by professional pianists, by her most talented students, even by herself. But never had she heard it played with such raw emotion, such perfect understanding of what Chopin had been trying to express. Maria's entire body seemed to be connected to the music. Her fingers danced across the keys with incredible precision. But it was more than just technical skill. She was pouring her heart into every note, letting the music flow through her like a river of pure emotion. Margaret realized she was holding her breath. She had been so wrong, so completely and utterly wrong about this woman. This wasn't some cleaning lady who had overstepped her boundaries. This was a true artist, someone who understood music in ways that Margaret was only beginning to comprehend. When the final notes of the nocturne faded into silence, Maria sat perfectly still for a moment, her hands still resting on the keys. Margaret could see tears glistening on her cheeks in the moonlight. The silence that followed Maria's performance was deafening. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard across the room. She had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that had turned her entire world upside down in the span of a few minutes. Maria remained seated at the piano, her fingers still resting gently on the keys. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, and Margaret could see tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of joy, of a woman who had just reconnected with a part of herself she thought was lost forever. Margaret felt her own eyes welling up with tears. The shame was overwhelming, washing over her like a wave. How could she have been so wrong? How could she have dismissed someone with such incredible talent? The memory of her harsh words from weeks ago came flooding back, and she felt sick, too. Her stomach dot, she wanted to run away, to pretend she had never seen this performance and go back to her simple, organized world where everything made sense. But her feet wouldn't move. She was transfixed by the woman at the piano, this person she had treated so poorly without knowing anything about her story. Maria slowly lifted her hands from the keys and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She seemed to be gathering herself, preparing to return to her cleaning duties and pretend that this magical moment had never happened. But as she started to stand up from the bench, she noticed a movement in the doorway. Their eyes met across the room, and time seemed to stop. Maria's face went pale, and Margaret could see the fear in her eyes. Fear of being scolded again, of being told she didn't belong, of having this precious moment ruined by another harsh confrontation. Margaret's first instinct was to apologize for intruding, to back away and give Maria her privacy. But something deeper compelled her to step forward instead. She walked slowly across the room, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, each step feeling like a mile. When she reached the piano, Margaret looked down at Maria, who was still seated on the bench. The custodian's uniform, the cleaning cart in the hallway, the simple work shoes, none of it mattered anymore. All Margaret could see was an artist, a musician of extraordinary talent who had just shared something beautiful and sacred. I had no idea, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible in the large room. I had absolutely no idea. Maria looked up at her, confusion and fear still evident in her eyes. She started to stand up, probably to apologize or to explain herself, but Margaret gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Please don't get up, Margaret said softly. I'm the one who should be apologizing. The words hung in the air between them. Maria's eyes widened in surprise. In all her years of cleaning buildings, dealing with dismissive comments and being treated as invisible, she had never expected to hear an apology from someone like Margaret. I'm so sorry, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I was wrong. I was so completely, utterly wrong about you. What I just heard, that was the most beautiful performance of that piece I've ever experienced. Maria's hands trembled in her lap. She had imagined this moment so many times, being recognized for her talent, being seen as more than just a cleaning lady. But now that it was happening, she didn't know how to respond. How long have you been playing? Margaret asked, pulling up a chair from the front row of the small audience section. She wanted to sit at Maria's level, to show that she was no longer looking down on her. Maria's voice was shaky when she finally spoke. Since I was 5 years old, she said. My grandmother, she saved money for lessons. She said music was a gift. Your grandmother was right, Margaret said. But what you just played, that wasn't just talent. That was years of professional training, I can tell. Maria nodded slowly. I was a professor in Columbia, at the National University. I taught piano and performed with the orchestra. Margaret felt another wave of shame wash over her, a professor. Someone who had dedicated her life to music education, just like Margaret herself. Someone who understood the dedication and sacrifice required to master an instrument. What happened? Margaret asked gently. How did you end up here? And so Maria told her story. She talked about Carlos, her fiancé, who had died so young. She explained about the economic problems in Colombia, the cuts to arts programs, the lack of opportunities for musicians. She described her immigration to America, full of hope and dreams that had slowly crumbled in the face of bureaucracy and unrecognized credentials. Margaret listened without interrupting, her heart breaking with each detail. She thought about her own privileged path, the supportive family, the recognized degree, the network of connections that had helped her build her career. She had never had to prove herself in a foreign country, never had to start over from nothing. I tried to get my credentials recognized, Maria continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared her story. But it's expensive and complicated. The classes I need to take, the exams I have to pass. I work nights so I can study during the day, but progress is slow. And meanwhile, you're surrounded by music every night, Margaret said, finally understanding the full weight of Maria's situation. You clean these rooms, dust these pianos, and you can't play them? Maria nodded. Some nights it's too hard. I want to quit to find work somewhere else. But I can't stay away from the music. Even if I can't play, at least I can hear it. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had learned. Then she looked at Maria with new eyes, seeing not just her talent, but her strength, her resilience, her unwavering love for music despite everything she had been through. That piece you just played? Margaret said. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It's one of my favorites, and I've heard it performed by some very talented people. But I've never heard it played with such emotion, such understanding. You didn't just play the notes, you told a story? Maria's eyes filled with tears again. Music is a language, she said. It speaks when words are not enough. Yes, Margaret agreed. And you speak it fluently. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the evening's revelations settling between them. Margaret's mind was racing, thinking about opportunities, about connections, about ways she might be able to help. But more than that, she was thinking about the assumptions she had made, the prejudices she didn't even know she had. Maria, Margaret said finally, I want to make this right. I don't know how yet, but I want to help you get back to where you belong. Maria looked at her with surprise. You don't have to do anything. You already did something important tonight. What's that? You listened, Maria said simply. You saw me as a person, not just someone who cleans your studio. That means more than you know. Margaret felt tears rolling down her own cheeks now. Such a simple thing, treating someone with dignity and respect, and yet she had failed to do it until tonight. It's not enough, Margaret said, but it's a start. As they sat together in the moonlit music hall surrounded by the lingering echoes of Maria's beautiful performance, both women knew that this moment would change everything. For Maria, it was the first time in years that someone had recognized her true self. For Margaret, it was a humbling reminder that talent and worth aren't determined by job titles or circumstances. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of her encounter with Maria. The sound of that beautiful nocturne kept echoing in her mind, along with the image of Maria's tears and the pain in her voice as she shared her story. By the time the sun came up, Margaret had made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. She arrived at the academy earlier than usual the next morning, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The first thing she did was walk straight to the director's office. Dr. Williams had been running the Riverside Music Academy for over 20 years, and Margaret respected him greatly. If anyone could help her figure out how to right this wrong, it would be him. Margaret, you're here early, Dr. Williams said, looking up from his morning coffee. What can I do for you? Margaret took a deep breath. I need to tell you about something that happened last night. Something that's going to sound unbelievable. She told him everything. About her initial encounter with Maria, about following her to the music hall, about the incredible performance she had witnessed. Dr. Williams listened carefully, his eyebrows rising higher with each detail. You're telling me that our night custodian is a professionally trained pianist? He asked when Margaret finished. Not just professionally trained, Margaret said. She's extraordinary. Dr. Williams, in all my years of teaching, I've rarely heard anyone play with such skill and emotion. She was a professor at the National University in Columbia. She performed with orchestras. Dr. Williams leaned back in his chair, processing this information. And she's been cleaning our building for how long? Over a year? Margaret said. Every night she's been walking past these pianos, these practice rooms, knowing she could teach our students things they've never learned, and we've been treating her like she's invisible. The director was quiet for a moment, then he smiled. Well, then we need to fix that, don't we? Over the next few hours, Margaret and Dr. Williams worked together to create a plan. They researched the process for getting foreign music credentials recognized in the United States. They reached out to contacts at local universities who might be able to help expedite Maria's certification. Most importantly, they figured out how to create an immediate opportunity for Maria to start teaching again. The academy had been looking for an assistant instructor for months. Someone to help with the younger students and assist with the busy recital season. It was a perfect entry-level position that could give Maria a chance to prove herself while she worked on getting her full credentials recognized. That evening, Margaret waited nervously for Maria to arrive for her cleaning shift. She had asked Dr. Williams to let her handle the conversation, knowing that Maria might be more comfortable talking with her after their breakthrough the night before. When Maria appeared with her cleaning cart, Margaret was waiting in the hallway. Outside the music hall, "Maria," she called softly, "could I speak with you for a moment?" Maria looked surprised and a little worried. "Did I do something wrong?" "I promise I won't touch the piano again without permission." "No, no," Margaret said quickly. "You didn't do anything wrong. In fact, I wanted to talk to you about something wonderful." She led Maria to a small conference room where Dr. Williams was waiting. Maria's eyes widened when she saw the director, and Margaret could tell she was nervous. "Please sit down," Dr. Williams said warmly. "Margaret has told me about your musical background, and we have a proposition for you." Maria sat on the edge of her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I don't understand." "We'd like to offer you a position as an assistant piano instructor," Margaret said. "It would start part-time, working with our younger students, but it could grow into something more as you get your credentials fully recognized." Maria stared at them in shock. "You want me to teach here?" "We want you to return to doing what you love," Dr. Williams said. "Margaret tells me you're an exceptional pianist. We need exceptional people on our faculty." Tears started flowing down Maria's cheeks. "But I'm just the cleaning lady. I don't have the right papers yet. My English isn't perfect." "Your English is fine," Margaret said gently. "And as for the papers, we're going to help you with that process. I've already made some calls to friends at the university who specialize in credential recognition. They're willing to work with you." "But why would you do this for me?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret felt her own eyes filling with tears. "Because I was wrong about you. Because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted. And because everyone deserves a chance to do what they love." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Maria continued her cleaning job during the transition, but she also started working with Margaret's younger students. The children adored her immediately. There was something about Maria's gentle patience, an obvious love for music that connected with them in a special way. Margaret watched in amazement as Maria worked with a 7-year-old who had been struggling with basic finger positioning. Where Margaret had been feeling frustrated, Maria remained calm and encouraging. She showed the child how to curve his fingers by pretending they were holding small oranges, turning the lesson into a game. "She has a gift for teaching," Margaret told Dr. Williams after observing one of Maria's lessons. "The kids respond to her differently than they do to me." "That's because she remembers what it feels like to struggle," Dr. Williams replied. "She hasn't forgotten that music should be joyful, not just perfect." The breakthrough moment came during the spring recital preparation. Margaret had been working with David, her advanced student, on that challenging Rachmaninoff piece for weeks. He had the technical skill, but something was missing from his performance. It sounded correct, but not compelling. Maria had been quietly observing the lesson, helping to organize sheet music and prepare the practice room. When David finished his run-through, looking frustrated with his performance, Maria spoke up. "May I suggest something?" she asked Margaret hesitantly. Margaret nodded, curious to hear Maria's perspective. Maria sat down next to David at the piano. "This piece, it's not just about the notes being right. Rachmaninoff was writing about homesickness, about missing his homeland. Do you feel that sadness in the music?" She played a few measures, and immediately the room filled with emotion. The same notes David had been playing suddenly told a story of longing and loss. David's eyes lit up with understanding. "I was just trying to hit all the right keys. I wasn't thinking about what the music meant." "Exactly," Maria said. Technique is important, but music without feeling is just noise. Margaret watched this exchange with growing admiration. Maria wasn't just a talented performer. She was a natural teacher who understood how to connect with students on an emotional level. The spring recital was a huge success. David's performance of the Rachmaninoff piece brought the audience to tears, and several parents approached Margaret afterward asking about the new instructor they'd heard was helping with lessons. But the most magical moment came at the end of the evening. Dr. Williams had asked Maria to perform a piece as part of the faculty showcase. She chose the same Chopin nocturne that Margaret had heard her play that fateful night. As Maria's fingers danced across the keys, the entire audience was mesmerized. Parents who had come expecting a typical student recital found themselves witnessing a truly professional performance. When she finished, the applause went on for several minutes. After the recital, Margaret found Maria backstage, still glowing from her performance. "How does it feel?" Margaret asked. Maria smiled, her eyes bright with joy. "Like coming home," she said simply. 6 months later, Maria had her credentials fully recognized and was offered a full-time position at the academy. She and Margaret had become close friends and teaching partners, often collaborating on lessons and supporting each other's students. Margaret learned something valuable from their friendship. She discovered that assuming the worst about people was easy, but taking the time to really see them was transformative. Maria taught her that dignity and respect aren't earned through job titles or credentials. They're basic human rights that everyone deserves. The academy was better for having Maria on the faculty, but Margaret was better for having learned to look beyond surface appearances. She never again made assumptions about someone based on their circumstances, and she made sure to treat every person she met with the respect they deserved. Years later, when people asked Margaret about the most important lesson she'd learned in her teaching career, she would always tell them about the night she discovered that the most beautiful music sometimes comes from the most unexpected places.